Welcome everyone to another edition of What Went Wrong, a video series where I take a look at certain aspects of wrestling's history, whether it be a match, a storyline, or a pay-per-view event, and I try to determine where exactly things went wrong. And when you're looking for things to analyze, where things went wrong in professional wrestling, WCW is a pretty good well to draw from, and I consider myself a WCW fan. I grew up with it, and when things really got hot in 96, 97, I was all in on WCW, NWO, and all that other fun stuff. I loved it, but WCW ended up failing spectacularly, and since it's October, I think no better pay-per-view event would be more worthy of talking about during the month of October, during Halloween season, than WCW's October tradition, Halloween Havoc, a pay-per-view event that I absolutely adored as a kid. Now, we can talk about things that were done wrong on specific Halloween Havoc events, like the Chamber of Horrors, and like some of the things I'm going to be talking about in this episode, but the whole Halloween Havoc concept was so cool to me, a Halloween-themed pay-per-view. And it was one of those things, good or bad, I looked forward to it every year. It was just like something I could set my watch to. I'm going to get Halloween Havoc in October, and considering how much of a Halloween nut I am, to get a Halloween-themed wrestling pay-per-view was just right up my alley. Again, good or bad. So today we're going to be talking about a brick out of the wall to cause the collapse of WCW. And when people talk about the fall of WCW, various things come to mind. David Arquette winning the world title, Vince Russo's booking, the finger poke of doom, the Starrcade 97 Sting Hogan debacle, all those type of things. However, I'm going to be taking a look at something that gets talked about, but not in great detail as being an example of WCW's ultimate failure. And that is Halloween Havoc 1998, a very significant pay-per-view event for WCW during this time. And I want to start this off by saying, I don't think Halloween Havoc 98 is a completely terrible show. I don't. There are some things on this show that I actually quite enjoy. However, when you look at what they had here on paper, this should have been an amazing spectacle for WCW. This should have been their pay-per-view of the year, easily. I won't say biggest pay-per-view of the year or most successful pay-per-view, because obviously they had just done the Bash of the Beach with Karl Malone and Dennis Rodman, and that did big numbers. I think Road Wild with Jay Leno in the main event did big numbers as well. So I'm not saying that Halloween Havoc would have done a box office, pay-per-view buy rate on par with those earlier shows, but I think in terms of like overall quality, this had potential to be WCW's best and most enjoyable pay-per-view of the year. And instead, they kind of did some things where they shot themselves in the foot, that undercut what was overall maybe an okay show, maybe someone even goes far to say a good show, but kept it from being an absolutely amazing show, and would have been an easy, home run over WWF, who at the time, in their October, they were doing Judgment Day, which hinged on Stone Cold Steve Austin being the guest referee of the main event, and not much else. They didn't have a whole lot going on, whereas Halloween Havoc was like a WrestleMania quality card. It was in Las Vegas, which is WCW's their big city, right? That's where they held a lot of the big shows. And Eric Bischoff mentioned in the 83 Weeks podcast that for him, Halloween Havoc was the biggest pay-per-view of the year because they would go to Vegas and it was always treated like a big deal. And the card that they had for 1998 definitely reflected that. You look at this situation that they had two matches of legendary tag team partners facing each other. You had the Steiner brothers, who had their big falling out back in February, and all that build-up for Rick to get his revenge on Scott. And we finally got the pay-per-view encounter here at Halloween Havoc, with the tag team championships involved, which is a perfect scenario for the Steiner brothers, who are a heavy contender for probably my favorite tag team of all time. If they're not number one, they're very high up there. And you also had the Battle of the Outsiders, Kevin Nash versus Scott Hall, a team that broke out when the NWO split and went into the Wolfpack and Hollywood factions. Nash went to go form the Wolfpack, and Hall stayed loyal to Hollywood, and then did an unfortunate real-life imitating art style angle with his own personal demons. I will elaborate on that later, but on paper, Hall versus Nash feels like a big deal. You also had the very first pay-per-view encounter between Bret the Hitman Hart and the Icon Sting. The Sharpshooter versus the Scorpion Deathlock. This seemed like tailor-made to be an absolute classic. You had Hulk Hogan facing the Ultimate Warrior in a rematch of their classic WrestleMania 6 match almost a decade later, and then finally being thrust back together for the epic rematch that we never got in WWF. You had Goldberg versus Diamond Dallas Page for the WCW World Heavyweight title. The first pure WCW main event since the formation of the NWO, because after that, every WCW World title match and every WCW pay-per-view main event was some version of WCW versus NWO, or even in some cases NWO versus NWO, when you look at the Hogan Savage cage match from Uncensored earlier this year. But this was the first pure WCW main event in over 2 years. Two homegrown WCW stars facing for the largest title that they had. That also felt like a big deal. And then when you consider you had Chris Jericho as the television champion, you had mid-carders like Raven and Saturn, and you had the Cruiserweight division to help fill everything out, on paper it's like, oh my god, this is an amazing card. They're going to knock it out of the park and it's going to be great. Unfortunately, that did not happen. Where did things go wrong? Well, the biggest issue that this card had was time management. Now, I know a lot of people are going to point to one match in particular as being the biggest problem that this show had, and trust me, I'm going to get into that. But the biggest overall problem with this pay-per-view was time management, because quite infamously, this show ran over the 3-hour pay-per-view time frame that was allotted to them, which meant that a lot of people actually got the pay-per-view feed cut, and they did not get to see the main event, which is a cruel joke when you consider the match that came right before it. But again, I'll elaborate on that later. And it's amazing to me, looking at this card and rewatching it in preparation for this video, there's so many instances where they just cram things in there that don't need to be there. Like, no disrespect to the two workers, but did Alex Wright versus Fit Finlay really need to be on this card on a show that's already kind of full? I mean, couldn't you just easily drop this one? Did you have to debut a Conan music video on this card? Couldn't you save that for Nitro the next night, or maybe even a few days before on Thunder or something? Did Hollywood Hogan need to cut a promo right after the opening match? And look, full props and respect to the Nitro girls. I felt like they added a lot to Monday Nitro, and they were a great attraction. And I am in no way, shape, or form opposed to sexy women doing dance routines. Believe me. However, they had multiple segments on this show. Multiple dance segments were dedicated to the Nitro girls doing their routines. And again, it all looked nice. I'm not saying it didn't. I'm just saying on a show where you're kind of strapped for time, and on a show that ran long and went over, maybe cut the Nitro Girl stuff down to maybe one segment, maybe two, if you need that. And again, to be fair, like, having them do their stuff on pay-per-view actually felt like kind of a big deal, because that was normally a Nitro exclusive thing. So to do it on pay-per-view, it's like, okay, this is cool. I'm kind of digging it. And for those that don't enjoy it, hey, you get a bathroom break. So it kind of works for a lot of different reasons. It jazzes the crowd up. The people that like that stuff can enjoy it. And if you don't like it, instant bathroom break. So it's kind of like, it's a perfect thing to have on the show. I just don't feel like you needed to do it more than twice. And I would even say twice is pushing it, especially on the traditional 3-hour pay-per-view format. Maybe if you had an extra hour, you can do that, but having it spread out all over the show with multiple segments, I think, was kind of overdoing it. And it ended up biting WCW in the butt, because a lot of people didn't get to see the main event because the pay-per-view feed got cut because the pay-per-view ran long. And it's one of those examples of, management in WCW. And how does something like that happen? How do they not have somebody backstage keeping track of how long the show's going and cutting things out? Because, again, going back to the podcasts, I remember Bruce Pritchard talking about WrestleMania 10 and how they had to drop the 10-man tag because certain things went long, they ran out of time, and they had to get to the main event, obviously, because Bret's going to win the title. And, it's a tough decision to make. It's not fun for those 10 guys. There's also the story that the ladder match ran long and Savage, confronted Shawn backstage about it for going long with the classic ladder match. But in any case, in WWF, there's a clear, okay, we need to hit our spots and we need to do this and this and this. These are the things that absolutely need to happen. And Goldberg and DDP is one of those things that should have been protected, and this could have easily been avoided, but it felt like a lot of times in WCW that there was nobody really at the helm. There was nobody like guiding the ship. It was just kind of like everybody gets to do whatever they want, and everything's just kind of this wild free-for-all, which ultimately led to WCW's downfall that really started to snowball in 1999. So we're getting at this point in late 98, we're getting very, very close to WCW's ultimate downfall. And this pay-per-view is a perfect example of that, of, how things were kind of getting out of control behind the scenes, just because it's amazing to me that they didn't have somebody backstage working on the timing of the show and making sure that they didn't run long and making sure that that Goldberg DDP match happened when it was supposed to happen. But it is what it is. And indicators of how haphazard WCW would become creatively started to rear their ugly heads here as well, because this pay-per-view had a total of 12 matches. Why did it have so many matches? I don't know, but some of these matches were added day of or a couple days before the show, like the TV title match and some of the cruiserweight matches and what have you. I already talked about Fit Finlay and Alex Wright. Why are these matches on a show that's already full of like top tier marquee matches that people are going to pay to see? Like, why are we filling it out even more? If you want to get guys on the show, and this is always my solution to these type of things, is like, look, if you want to give guys a paycheck and you want to get them on the show, just do a battle royal. Like, that's the easy catch-all, and you can even make the battle royal for some kind of prize that you can do something with storyline-wise. But if you want to get guys on the show, battle royal is the easiest way to do that, and maybe that's what they should have done here. And again, like, I don't think all of the matches were bad. I just think trying to do 12 matches on what's supposed to be a 3-hour pay-per-view was, again, poor planning on WCW's part. The show opened up with the first segment with the Nitro Girls, and it probably should have been the last segment. It was very cool to see them open up the show. I thought that was great, but it's also probably the last time we should have saw them. Maybe, again, if you're going to do it a second time, maybe somewhere in the middle after a big match is like kind of a nice cool down and kind of a halftime performance, shall we say. But other than that, it's we got a little too much of the Nitro Girls here, I felt. We also got a promo segment between Rick Steiner and Buff Bagwell setting up their tag team championship match against Scott Steiner and the Giant later in the show. More on that later. But the wrestling of the night began with the TV title match between Chris Jericho and Raven. On paper, a completely baffling match because both guys were heels. And I'm not a huge fan of heel versus heel matches because to me there's no such thing, because eventually the fans are going to pick a side, and you have put two villains up against each other. It's like the Saturday Night's Main Event match from '86 between Randy Savage and Jake Roberts. Jake Roberts became the babyface in that match because everybody hated Savage, and that's kind of what happens whenever you do these things. So, and that's best case scenario. Worst case scenario is that everybody hates everyone and nobody cares, which you don't want that. So this was kind of a weird match to have, and it's even stranger that Raven and Saturn, who had a really good feud going, they had a great match at Fall Brawl just the month before, and it would have been nice. It's like, maybe they should have saved Raven and Saturn for this pay-per-view to give them one more big match, but in any case, all of my criticisms aside, I think Jericho and Raven, even though the mixing of them together was very strange, both characters were doing really, really well in WCW at this point. Jericho, I'd said, had really come to life as a character and a persona, starting with his Cruiserweight Championship run, the feud with Dean Malenko, the stuff with Rey Mysterio, all that great stuff. The man of 1,004 holes or whatever that was, the list, the first list of Jericho. All that stuff was great, and he'd carried that over into becoming television champion, which should have set him up to be bigger and bigger and bigger from there. Unfortunately, that was kind of his cutoff point, and that was kind of his plateau for WCW. Again, another mistake that they made. And Raven was red hot at this point. I remember Raven once saying in a shoot interview that him and the Flock was probably the greatest stable of all time that never got a big win. And I think that's a fair assessment because the Flock was really over. They were doing really well with the stuff with Saturn, and Raven was just very interesting, very cool, very cutting edge. And it's like, you look back on it, it's like, man, could you imagine if they'd actually done something with the Flock? I've had all these crazy ideas in my mind. It's like, what if they did a big gang war? You had NWO Black and White, you had NWO Black and Red, you had the Flock, and you had WCW. What if you did something that involved all four factions kind of going at each other? What if you did Raven's Flock versus the Wolfpack? What if you did Raven going up against guys like Kevin Nash or Hulk Hogan? He actually, when he first got to WCW, had a showdown with Randy Savage that was like, whoa! You know, it just blew my mind putting those two together. And they didn't do anything with it. So again, WCW kind of haphazard and missing out on good opportunities. But Jericho and Raven, red hot talents at this point, and they went out there and had a pretty damn good match, all things considered. No story, no build-up, heel versus heel match, not an ideal scenario, but they went out there and had a really solid opener for the television title, and really a strong indicator of just how good they both really were and how interesting and how over they both really were, because it was a really good showing for both of them. And considering that this card had a lot of big main event caliber matches like Sting and Brett, Hogan Warrior, Goldberg DDP, Hall and Nash, that type of stuff, this is an ideal opener, something like this. Two fresh, hot young guys just going out there and having a really exciting match for the opener. So all good things around in this opener, despite kind of a shaky setup for it. Next up, we got a Hollywood Hogan promo in front of the live crowd where he talked about his upcoming match with Warrior later on that show, and they also senselessly recapped his attack on his nephew, Horace Hogan. What's your favorite Horace Hogan match? Chat me up. You know, it wasn't bad or anything. It was a fairly typical Hollywood Hogan promo, but again, on a show that ended up running long, you probably could have cut this out or at least trimmed it. Didn't really need to be there. Again, if you'd had 4 hours, whatever, go for it. It would have been fine. But in this case, this is something that could have easily been dropped, in my opinion. But next up, the next match was a straight up power match, Wrath versus Ming. Now, on paper today, it looks like kind of a pointless match because Wrath ultimately didn't ascend to any kind of main event level, and Ming was kind of on the back end of his career. I love Haku. I was a mark for the guy when I was a kid, and I always had a soft spot for like his believable toughness, and that certainly carried over here. I thought these two had a nice like kind of down and dirty, beat each other up for a few minutes, and then Wrath gets the win with the meltdown. Very simple, basic filler match that got some nice power moves out of it, but within the context of the time period, Wrath felt like somebody that was getting over. The meltdown pump handle slam finisher was getting over, and it felt like he was being set up for Goldberg. It felt like this was going to be a major program for Goldberg, and Wrath being built up during this time actually kind of made sense. Unfortunately, his push got derailed because they had him lose to Kevin Nash, and then Nash went into Starrcade 98 to face Goldberg. And I was like, you know, you could have put Nash in the Starrcade match without beating Wrath, and you could have kept building up Wrath. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. So at the time, this match didn't feel as pointless as it does now. Ultimately, the benefit of this match should have been to further build Wrath, but since Wrath ultimately didn't go anywhere, it's just kind of like this random match that didn't belong on the card. And there's another one that, on a show that had too many matches, is one that feels like it could have been dropped. But at the time, it actually kind of made sense to have it there. And it was a nice, solid, basic power match that achieved the goal it was looking to achieve. It's just that goal didn't get achieved, or they failed in that goal months after this pay-per-view. But what are you going to do? Now, here is where we start to run into some problems that contributed to the timing issues. We get a Cruiserweight title contenders match between Juventud Guerrera and Disco Inferno. Now, at this point in time, the Cruiserweight division, even with guys like Malenko and Jericho kind of moving out of the Cruiserweight division, and Ultimo Dragon's injuries effectively ending his run in the division, they still had a lot of top-tier talent. Juventud Guerrera, the Guerreros, both of them, Chavo and Eddie. Rey Mysterio was still a part of it. You had the rising star Billy Kidman, who seemed to be like the new crown jewel that they were going to build the Cruiserweight division around. He was actually the defending champion on this show. So they had some top-tier talent, and here the number one contenders match is Juventud taking on Disco Inferno. Now, I don't necessarily have anything against Disco as a talent. I know he's a bit of a lightning rod for controversy online by saying stupid stuff that pisses people off nowadays. But, you know, when I look at his wrestling career, I think Disco was a guy that embraced his gimmick and was a funny guy and played the role well. He was the honky-tonk man of his era, and I'm completely fine with that. However, Should he be number one in line to get a cruiserweight title shot? Not really. To me, that kind of goes against what the cruiserweight division was all about. And it's made even worse by the fact that he actually won this match with Juventud. Again, not a bad match or anything. It was just questionable. Like, this comedy guy is beating, like, top-tier cruiserweights to get a title shot later on the show. And again, to talk about the timing issues, there were a couple of times in 1998 where Booker T was involved in 2 television title matches on the same show, or like had to win 2 matches to walk out with the television title. They did it at Super Brawl and Great American Bash, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And that's fine. You can do that stuff. But again, on a pay-per-view that's already loaded, you might as well just do one cruiserweight title match. You don't need the contenders match and the cruiserweight title match crammed onto one show. Or just pick one or the other. Like, drop one and do the other one. You can do the contenders match here and then do the title match on Nitro or Thunder, in the next week. Or build to the next pay-per-view or whatever. But doing both here, again, contributed to the card being a little over-bloated and created some problems for the card, as we'll get into later into the show. Speaking of matches that did not need to be on this card, we had Alex Wright taking on Fit Finlay, which I've already talked about. Alex Wright got the win. Again, no knock on either talent. This match did not need to be on the show. And we also had Saturn basically destroying Lodi, which would have been fine before the final match with Raven, but Saturn already defeated Raven and effectively ended the flock and, ended that whole feud. And here he is still working with members of the flock, the former flock, with Lodi. It seems like a waste of time for Saturn. And again, maybe they should have just saved the Raven-Saturn blow-off match for this card instead of doing it the month before. But in any case, that match kind of felt like a waste of time as well. Just a waste of time in general for everyone involved. Again, do a Battle Royal if you want to get some of these guys on there. But that leads us into the next Nitro Girls segment, which I believe came... Now, in between the matches, you get more filler segments. There's 2 segments with the Nitro Girls in between all of this. One where they're dressed up as cowboys and spreading their legs. Again, not complaining, but again, we had timing issues on the show, so giving them 2 additional segments, probably a little overkill. And there was also a Big Papa Pump promo segment that set up the situation with Rick, because it was originally supposed to be just Rick and Scott one-on-one, but then it got changed into a tag team title match with Scott and his hand-picked substitute, the Giant, taking on Rick Steiner and Buff Bagwell. Now, the tag team champions at this point were Scott Steiner and Scott Hall, but Scott Hall was busy with Nash, so he needed a substitute, and it was the Giant. Now, I think having the Steiners face each other in a tag team match with different partners, I think is probably a better way to go. I don't know if Scott and Rick one-on-one, straight up without a little bit of gaga, would have been that great. I'm saying this as someone with a ton of respect for both guys. It's just that notoriously tag team partners just don't make great opponents for whatever reason, so I think dressing it up a little bit actually worked really well. It ended up working really well, but this whole setup here and involving J.J. Dillon and all this other stuff, and again, booking all of this and making it official on the pay-per-view itself just created more timing issues and something that should have been mapped out long before this pay-per-view even started, and it was just, again, very, very messy. A lot of filler on this show that, again, probably could have easily been trimmed. Next up was the Cruiserweight title match made on this show. Billy Kidman defending against Disco Inferno. Again, whatever. That was the hand we were dealt. Now, the match itself was actually quite good. It was not a bad match, and Billy had to overcome a pile driver from Disco Inferno to ultimately come back and get the win. So the match itself was fine. It's just, again, did we need a contenders match on the show, and was Disco really the best choice? Did anybody really think that Disco Inferno was a threat to Billy Kidman's championship run? I don't know. Maybe they didn't want to burn through all of his high-caliber opponents right away, so they put Disco in there first to kind of, like, get his feet wet, and then build Kidman up to, like, the Hoovies and the Rey Mysterios and those type of guys. Like, you look at the situation that Kidman had at Starrcade 98 later that year, much bigger match for him, and it came off much better, but this was just not great. It also kind of makes Billy Kidman look bad because he's barely beating a guy that wrestled earlier in the night. So it just kind of, again, kind of a messy situation all around. Match itself was not bad. It's just too much time was dedicated to setting up a cruiserweight title match on a show that couldn't afford to waste time, as we'll see when we get into the main event. And then we had the tag team title situation, which I already mentioned was kind of convoluted in how the whole thing was set up. But I'll say this, a long time ago I did a video talking about my top 10 favorite matches from Halloween Havoc's history. This match was on the list. I thought the Rick Steiner, Scott Steiner stuff came off really, really well on the show because on paper, it looked like another obvious NWO trap that was going to end with the babyface getting beat up, where Buff Bagwell pretended to have changed his ways and was going to be Rick's partner, and it's like, okay, and you're immediately watching it back then, I was like, okay, another NWO beatdown incoming, and yes, they did do that turn, but Rick Steiner overcame it, won the tag titles on his own, and then following the tag title match finally got that one-on-one encounter with his brother Scott, getting revenge, defeating him, and paying off the storyline that began way back in February with the Scott Steiner split and turn against his brother. So honestly, all of this came off exceptionally well. This is what some might call like purely an angle or just a pure sports entertainment type of match where it's not about the technical ability being displayed, but rather the dramatic element in the story being played out and having bells and whistles and all that other fun stuff. But whatever you want to call it or however you want to describe it, it came off really, really well and was one of the highlights of the show for me. And again, speaking as a Steiner Brothers mark, I was just happy to see the storyline that had been built up for so long handled so well. The previous year, they also had a long storyline where the two brothers were chasing the tag titles from the outsiders who were avoiding them at all costs. So, and that yielded some very, very good things. So, the Steiners had a really good couple of years there for storyline direction in 97 and 98. And this, again, for its convoluted setup, they actually managed to persevere, pull through, and make something really cool, exciting, and memorable out of it. So, my hat's off to everyone involved. This actually came off really well. And we go from one tag team partner explosion to another as Kevin Nash, the leader of the Wolfpack, took on his friend for life, Scott Hall, loyal to NWO Hollywood. So a lot more going on than just a basic war between factions. This was like a war between brothers. Hall and Nash, the outsiders, the two guys that defined the NWO and gave it its personality, that you would think if there was ever an NWO split, they would have to be on the same side, which I always felt. I remember a few years ago I put out a video, a What Went Wrong video, talking about what went wrong with the Wolfpack versus Hollywood storyline, and I said, it's like, look, on paper it should have been Hogan and Mach, the Mega Powers, versus the Outsiders, who were the Wolfpack. That's what it should have been, but maybe Randy and Hogan were going through a period where they weren't getting along and that couldn't do, or maybe Hogan was pulling some kind of power play where he needed a cool guy in Hollywood, which ended up being Hall. I have no idea, but the basic lineup of the two factions was a little off, but it did lead to this match, which on paper is a very good idea to do this match. Unfortunately, they decided to take the real-life troubles of Scott Hall being an alcoholic and play it into weekly television. Now, sometimes that works really well in wrestling. In this case, where Hall is clearly having problems that should be addressed off camera, if Hall had beaten his demons by this point, you could probably do this and would be okay, but he was still struggling at this point, so having him acknowledge it on TV and making a whole angle out of it with him stumbling out there drunk, it's more uncomfortable than anything else. And the storyline just did not work for anybody involved, fans and performers alike. And it severely undercut what could have been a big deal, Hall and Nash. And the match itself, Hall and Nash, they had a really good match for the Intercontinental title at SummerSlam 94. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. So they can work well together. They worked with each other and against each other in various tag matches and things like that. So you would think that they know each other, inside and out. They'd be able to put something good together. But it got to a point, the match was presented in a way that complemented the story that had been told, and the story itself didn't work, so this match just kind of came off as awkward, especially with Nash simply powerbombing Hall, and then instead of going for the pin, he just felt sorry for him and walked out of the ring and got counted out. It was just kind of felt like what could have been an explosion and a great match between former partners, just kind of went out on a wet fart and unfortunately didn't work. Now, it is worth pointing out that Kevin Nash's star was really rising with the Wolfpack thing, which is amazing because the Wolfpack really, really struggled to stay afloat with untimely injuries kind of hurting them. Sting would get hurt. Randy Savage had already gotten hurt. They inexplicably took Kurt Hennig and Rick Rude away from them. And so by the end of it, like the Wolfpack, it was just Luger, Conan, and Nash by the time it was all said and done. And it's like, man, that's rough. But Nash, with the theme song and the red and the black, his star really seemed to be rising with that whole presentation, and it did. And so it's no surprise that he was main eventing Starrcade later that year against Goldberg. We got one more Nitro Girls segment with them in colored wigs and leather outfits. Very nice. Not complaining. Again, not complaining. I just feel like maybe we did it a little too much. And I believe this is also the point of the pay-per-view where they debuted Conan's music video. I'm not sure on that because the Peacock version does not have the music video. But in any case, again, why are we debuting a music video on this show? On a show that's already bloated, when you can easily do this on TV? Why are we having multiple Nitro Girl segments on a show that's already bloated? The whole thing is just trying to cram 10 pounds of shit into a 20-pound bag, and that's what this pay-per-view felt like, for sure. And even with the music video cut out, on the Peacock version, this pay-per-view is 3 hours and 15 minutes long, so it really goes to show how much time was spent just dawdling and rushing to set certain things up just to make this pay-per-view happen. It really, again, paints the picture that WCW, even at this point, after having some great successes earlier in the year, was very haphazardly run and constructed, and that would show itself more and more in the following 2 years. Now, the next bout was a personal dream match of mine. Two of my top 5 favorite wrestlers of all time, Bret the Hitman Hart and Sting, facing each other for the United States Heavyweight Championship. But really, what this match was for me, Scorpion Deathlock versus the Sharpshooter, the masters of the same hold with different names going at it. Bret was the big hero in WWF during the 90s in the post-Hogan era, and Sting was the flag bearer for WCW, coming off the biggest run of his career, going up against Hogan heading into Starrcade 97. So this was a big deal for me. I was all about this match, and I expected it to be really good, and it was fine. The match is fine, but comes off a little awkwardly, especially when you work in like ref bumps, and I think the big problem here was Bret Hart's character, and Bret's talked about it. Bischoff has talked about it. Depending on who you believe, their stories kind of contradict a little bit. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle. I don't know. But Bret Hart's character was so poorly handled, especially after they turned him heel and did that whole stupid thing where it's like, he's not in the NWO, but he's palling around with Hogan and that nonsense, that ridiculous stuff they were doing. Bret Hart kind of felt royally misused by this point when he could have been the biggest babyface on the planet. And because he was playing this heel character that didn't suit him, didn't fit him, didn't do any favors, he didn't even feel like Bret Hart anymore. It results in matches like this that feel a little awkward and feel a little off, and like Bret Hart almost doesn't belong in WCW programming. It's almost like he was tailor-made to be in WWF, maybe in the same way that Sting was tailor-made to be outside of WWE, and that's why he didn't really work when he was there. I don't know, but it's the match itself, again, it was fine, but nowhere near it came nowhere near matching my lofty expectations of it. And I remember Bret talked about it in his book where it's like he beat up Sting with a fake baseball bat in a stretcher job segment that once again went way, way, way too long on a show that was already overbloated and going way, way, way too long. And this was Sting's kind of departure from WCW television for a while he healed up, and the NWO was able to reform in his absence, and then he would come back the following year, setting him up for failed heel runs and things of that sort. So, I will say this, seeing Sting in the red and the black, kind of an underrated run for him. It wasn't very long, but he looked really cool in the red and the black getup. And I personally, Sting joining the Wolfpack, I was never in favor of that, because to me, Sting joining the NWO was just antithetical. But very much like the Wolfpack itself, a lot of things went wrong with it, but theme song was cool, everything looked cool, so everybody kind of dug it, and, maybe in spite of all the things that had gone wrong, the Wolfpack showed that there was some gold to be mined there, for sure. They really tapped into something. I just wish the execution had been much better, and even if they had executed it better, putting Sting in there would have not been something I would have been willing to entertain if I was in charge of creative any way, shape, or form, but again, that's just me. So they did the stretcher job for Sting, which again, like I said, was more time wasted on this show that didn't need to be there. And then following this match was the match, the one that everybody associates this pay-per-view with. Hogan Warrior 2 Electric Boogaloo. Now, there's not a whole lot I can say about this match that has not already been said. Many people will sit here and say it's one of, if not the worst match in wrestling history. I don't know if I would go that far, if it's the worst I've ever seen. I will definitely say it is the worst match of both men's careers. You look at the match that these two had at WrestleMania, which is an all-time classic. You look at the matches that these two guys were able to have on big stages when it mattered most. They would find ways to deliver something memorable in a good way. Hogan's track record at WrestleMania pretty much speaks for itself. Like, say whatever you want about him being limited technically, he could go out there and create something memorable. He's kind of like, he's to WrestleMania what Santa Claus is to Christmas. And even matches in WCW, like the Bash of the Beach match with Flair, or the first match with Dennis Rodman, which I really enjoyed. The match with Goldberg, which he had earlier this year. Hogan could create special moments in big match situations. And unfortunately, this thing didn't work. When you look at that awkward log rolling spot, the poor layout of the match, the bad timing on certain things, the botched fireball spot, which we actually just saw a botched fireball spot from Scarlett Bordeaux fairly recently, and I'm wondering, like, unless it's the original Sheik, how often does the fireball spot get botched? I feel like it gets botched way more than it's successfully hit, but that's just me. I remember Revenge of the Taker. They did an extended fireball spot where Mankind was supposed to accidentally hit Paul Bearer with the fireball, and he couldn't do it, so Taker just took the flash paper and just lit it in Paul Bearer's face because they just couldn't get the timing of the spot down. And maybe they should stop doing fireballs, because it feels like everybody screws that spot up. But in any case, the match was a train wreck. The match was a fiasco. Is there any way that this match could have been good? I have my doubts. And I say that as a fan of, somebody who grew up a fan of Hulk Hogan, and somebody who was not a fan of Warrior as a kid, but somebody who, in hindsight, appreciates what Warrior brought to the table. I don't think the match could have been good. I think at this point in 1998, the Ultimate Warrior character looked wildly out of place in the modern landscape of professional wrestling. It just looked like a relic from a bygone era. And maybe if you brought an Ultimate Warrior style character out today, it would fit in better. But at that time, a character like that just didn't work. It would be like Surfer Sting walking around in 1998. It just would have stood out like a sore thumb, and not in a good way. So he's trying to be the Ultimate Warrior of old in an era that just not accepting of the Ultimate Warrior concept at all, as opposed to what he was doing almost a decade earlier. Like, the Ultimate Warrior character in that era was tailor-made. He fit in perfectly like a glove. And it was clear by this point, after 2 months of build-up to this match, that the Warrior character was not working. The crowds had turned on it. The angles that they did were not well received on TV. The famous Magic Mirror segment, or the OWN, One Warrior Nation, and the segment where they kidnapped the disciple that looked horrible. Go back and watch that segment. It's not great. Just a lot of mistakes made with the Ultimate Warrior, and I think a lot of it comes down to Warrior had a lot of ideas for his persona, but none of them were good for this era of professional wrestling. I just don't think it worked at all. And Hogan was not at a point in his career where he was going to take chicken shit and turning it into chicken salad. That just wasn't going to happen. So the match itself was just a complete fiasco. And for many people in the audience, it was the last match they saw because, as I said, the pay-per-view ran long and the pay-per-view feed got cut for a lot of paying customers, which resulted in them having to air the Goldberg DDP match in full on Nitro. Further adding to the embarrassment of WCW, this Hogan Warrior fiasco was the last thing that a lot of people saw before the pay-per-view feed got cut. So that's unfortunate, but in any case, I do also want to talk about something that a lot of people have said about the Hogan Warrior match, where the long-standing belief is that Hulk Hogan orchestrated bringing Warrior into WCW for the sole purpose of beating him. Bischoff has said that's not true. My stance on it, I don't believe that Hogan went to somebody in WCW or that he went to Bischoff and said, brother, you know what we need? We need to bring in the Ultimate Warrior so I can beat him and get that win back or whatever. I don't believe that happened. I believe that Warrior was brought in to try and make money, very similarly to why Warrior was brought back in 96 by the WWF, to try and generate interest and make money. I think that was the driving force for bringing Warrior in, was to try and make money, generate interest, and get a beloved character of the past to generate interest. Something that WCW had done with great success, with Hulk Hogan, with Randy Savage, with Roddy Piper. It's something that had worked for them. It did not work here at all. Just a total failure all around. Now, do I think that in planning this show and in the creative construction of this pay-per-view, did Hogan go to somebody and say, hey, brother, he beat me the first time. I should probably go over this time. Yeah, I believe that happened, absolutely. But I don't believe that Warrior losing to Hogan was the sole purpose of him going over there. I think that's a bit overblown, and I think there were other factors at play to bringing Warrior over and other goals and desires to bring Warrior over, and everything just fell flat on its face, unfortunately. But in any case, that's enough talking about the worst match of the show and arguably the worst match in WCW history. Let's talk about one of the best matches that WCW put on, a match that in my top 10 Halloween Havoc video, I said was the best match in Halloween Havoc history. Goldberg defending the WCW World Heavyweight title against Diamond Dallas Page. Two homegrown WCW guys going at it in the closing match. Outstanding match. Love it. I think it's arguably the best match of Goldberg's career, and it shows the creativity of Diamond Dallas Page. The first time I watched that match, when Page countered the jackhammer into the diamond cutter, I jumped out of my chair and I said, oh my God, the streak is over. They got me. I was on the edge of my seat the entire time. This match was absolutely, unquestionably excellent. Superb match. Exciting, big fight feel. Had everything you want in a main event. It was stellar. And some people say, oh, it was only 10 minutes long. Yeah, it was 10 minutes long of awesomeness. It was one of the best pay-per-view main events WCW ever did. And I would put that match above most pay-per-view main events nowadays that go 25, 30, 40 minutes. This match was excellent and stellar. And it showed the talent of Diamond Dallas Page, and it showed how special Goldberg was as a spectacle and an attraction, where if you put him in the right scenario, and you put him with the right guy, they can make magic together, because Goldberg has a lot of intangibles that make him special, and Diamond Dallas Page is a talented enough guy to work with those intangibles and make something special out of it, and it worked beautifully for everyone involved. It's just a damn shame that, it kind of had this negative stigma put on it because the pay-per-view feed cut, because the show ran long, because there was so much freaking filler on this show that you did not need. There were promos and angles that were on the show that did not need to be there. The Nitro Girl segments, they did 4 of them. You only needed 1, maybe 2. There were 2 cruiserweight title... 2 matches related to the Cruiserweight title on the show when you only needed 1. There were filler matches on the show that absolutely did not need to be there. they just crammed way too much onto the show, and it unfortunately led to there being a negative impact on Goldberg and DDP's superb match. A match that should have been like, WCW should have been riding high after that. It's like, oh my God, we ended the pay-per-view on a high note, a couple bumps in the road, but we ended the pay-per-view on the high note. It was great, it was stellar, Goldberg retained, and everybody's happy. And because they had that fiasco with the pay-per-view feed cutting, it kind of put a damper on it, unfortunately. Now, in hindsight, people have gone back and reevaluated that match and said, oh my God, that match was amazing. But at the time, it was kind of like WCW was being made fun of because of the pay-per-view feed cut. And it was another... when you look back on WCW's history and you look at the moments that kind of led to their downfall, again, Finger Poke of Doom, botching Starrcade 97, David Arquette winning the title, all that jazz. Halloween Havoc 98 is not like a big one in the grand scheme of things. It's not like an indicator. It's like, oh my God, this led to the downfall of WCW. But it was emblematic of some of the issues that were manifesting in WCW at the time, where haphazard creative and lack of leadership led to issues that should have been easily avoidable under most circumstances. And it's just a perfect example of WCW shooting themselves in the foot, and we saw how they were just a few months after this, where everything just kind of fell off a cliff. WCW was not in a great place after this. So, that concludes my What Went Wrong video about Halloween Havoc 1998, a show that could have been amazing, should have been amazing, but wasn't, for a multitude of reasons. It was putting their faith in the wrong ideas and the wrong stories, and just baffling timing issues that threw the entire show off, unfortunately, and it negatively impacted the main event as a result. So, things that, again, could have been avoided, should have been avoided, but weren't. So, that is all I have for you now. Thanks again, everybody, for watching. If you want to keep in touch with me, you can follow me on Twitter. The link is in the description. Also, to keep up with this channel, be sure to like, subscribe, hit the little bell icon so you get notified when I post new videos. But that is all I have for you now. Thanks again, everybody, for watching, and I will see you all later.